everybody's different, right? Everybody's got a different head, everybody's got a different conditioning and so forth. So having said that, for some people in the beginning of the practice, to practice in the same place, to practice in a place that's quiet, can be helpful because of the degree to which they find themselves restless. So this is a way, it's like training wheels on a bike, right? But at the same time, what you're saying has validity in the sense that as time passes and as your practice progresses and as you mature, as you begin to open up and begin to wake up and begin to see things more clearly, the natural process, if you're really studying the teachings, the Dharma, and you're doing meditation correctly, the natural process will be one in which it begins to extend itself into when you're not doing formal meditation. It begins to be something that you have a handle on, that you have use of, that you can start to use in a more flexible way, in a more creative way. In terms of understanding, for example, one of the things that I mentioned here, and this is actually a high teaching in one of the Buddhist schools. They teach practicing meditation for 1 or 2 minutes at a time, as many times during the day as you can remember to do that. That's another way of cracking the case, So when you look at it if you really understand meditation, and if you practice it consistently and you get your feet wet and you have a sense of a kind of an understanding of this, the natural thing would be to want to use it. Not just practice formally, not just to become a monk or go join some cult, but to use this as a psychological tool to deal with the situations and the experiences you're having as a human being that we can call suffering. The anxiety, the depression, the instability of your behavior, the addictive behaviors, the difficulty in your relationships, the difficulty in being able to function and get things done in life, All of those are the things that human beings are dealing with. And so if you begin to understand these teachings and these practices, at some point it's a natural transition for you to begin to recognize that this is something that you can put to use in daily life as you go through your day. Driving your car, you can meditate. When you stop at a red light, meditate until the light changes, right? You can do it that way a little bit at a time, or you can do it big chunks at a time, right? Or you can mix it up, right? The idea is, the most important thing that there is to understand is that you're doing two things with meditation, and this is how it was brought forth from the traditions. You're doing two things. One is you're learning to relax the physical body and calm the mind. That's one part of the practice, right? And every time you practice, the intention is that you can continue to develop a relaxation response so that your body begins to be able to relax faster and deeper the longer you do the practice. The same thing is true with the mental state. If you're practicing meditation and you're focusing attention on the breath, the practice of meditation, the less time you spend thinking, which is when you're practicing meditation, the idea is every time you catch yourself thinking, bring the attention back to the breath. The less time you spend thinking, the more the possibility exists for you to recognize yourself. Because thinking generates an elusive identity. Thinking is generating this idea you have about who you are that has never even come into question for most of humanity, right? That's why that movie, Revolver, for those of you who weren't here on Tuesday, is an excellent movie to see exactly how this works, right? Because the heart of the matter in terms of the other piece of the action when it comes to meditation, so there's the relaxation and the calming of the mind. As the mind calms down, there's less noise, there's less static, more possibility to recognize something that's always here but has gone unnoticed because of the noise and the static, because of the preoccupation with the idea that you are the voice in your head, right? And that identity becomes so saturated in your psychology, you know what I mean? that even if you hear, it's interesting actually, even if you examine it, because this is the other part of the practice of meditation, when things calm down, then you can start to take a look. Right? Before there was just too much noise, too much activity, and there wasn't even anything that you were attempting to do. But once you come to realize that it's possible to get out of this mess that we're in, it's possible to get out of this mess that we're in terms of this misunderstanding about who we are, and this misunderstanding about what reality is. It's possible to get out of that mess. But if you're going to get out of that mess, you have to have a way to do it. And one way to do it is by using meditation to calm the mind and to relax the body. And then when you have some space and when you have some clarity, and if your mind is open, if you're receptive, then the second part of the activity can occur, which is the inquiry, to start to take a look. Take a look. Most people have never taken a look. One of the things, I mentioned Douglas Harding here before. I don't know how many of you really became familiar with him, but my first book was about Douglas Harding. And I came across something not that long ago that I'd never heard before. I wonder whether he did. But there was a story told about a monk interacting with a Zen master, and he said to the Zen master, how do I find myself? How do I find who I really am? Right? And the master said, find the one with no head, and that will be the one who allows you to realize the truth. Right? So this monk is thinking, find the one with no head. How am I going to find somebody with no head? And he's looking. He said, what was he talking about? Everybody has a head, right? And then all of a sudden it occurred to him that he didn't have one. Just like the rest of us. You don't have a head. That you have a belief that you have a head, but you've never seen your head, so it can't be anything other than a belief, right? What you're looking out of, right, can't see itself, right? So you will never see your head. So when the monk realized, no, he was talking about me. He was talking about, I'm headless. I don't have a head, right? And in the space where I think my head is, there's this awareness. Isn't this true? In the space where I think my head is, if I stop believing that it's here and use my direct experience, there's this awareness here. There's no head here, there's this awareness here, right? And Douglas Harding discovered that this is a way that you can directly experience the truth of what you are, right? Because the awareness that's here is you. That's you. The awareness that's here is you. But in order to experience that, in order to benefit from having that experience, right, you have to let go of a lot of beliefs that are not true. Like I am a physical body, like I am a personality, like I am the voice in my head, right? And when you start to look, because you have some space and because you're calmer and there's less static, when you start to look at that voice and really start to ask some important questions, like who am I and what is this voice? Where is this voice coming from, right? Because if you just look at the voice, if you just start paying attention to the voice in your head, and for a lot of people, that's already a very radical thing, right? Because most people never even, who was it? Michael Singer, in his first book, The Untethered Soul, good book if you want to read a good book, about this. He starts the book out by saying, I was sitting next to a friend of mine on a couch when I was younger, and all of a sudden, I looked at him and I said, do you have a voice in your head too? And he said, yeah, I do. You have a voice? This is the kind of thing most of us never talk about to one another. You know what I mean? We all just assume that everybody's got this going on, right? But when you start to look at it and you start to pay attention to it and you start to watch what it's saying, you will be introduced to your own insanity. If you pay attention to the voice in your head and you start to really watch what it's saying carefully, you'll be introduced to your own insanity, because that voice is crazy. I mean, really, consider what it says. It judges and evaluates everything that comes in front of you, right? Nothing escapes judgment and evaluation, right? And it rejects anything that doesn't fit your beliefs, right? Or your preconditioning, or what you consider to be true. It rejects anything that doesn't fit that, which creates conflict, right? And what are you in conflict with? Life, other people, yourself, the past, the future. This is the orientation of this. This is what the voice is, how the voice is talking about everything, right? And then, as I have said here before, if you believe that's your voice and you're aware of how crazy you are, because if it's your voice, then if it's crazy, you're crazy, right? Then your life becomes about not letting anybody find out, right? So everybody's keeping a secret, and the secret that everybody's keeping is I'm crazy, right? And I don't want you to find out, and you don't want me to find out that you're crazy. You see what I'm saying? But you see, when you start to understand what's going on and you realize that the mistake you're making is a very simple mistake. And that's one of the reasons I thought that the movie was very interesting, and the chapter in the book by Angelo was very good, when he said, isn't it interesting that the voice in your head always only speaks in the first person? Always only speaks in the first person, right? By that being the case, you wouldn't question it, right? If the voice in your head is saying, I am thinking, right? Then you would automatically relate to it, well, that must be me, right? But what if it's not you? And it's using the first person to have you identify with it. What if that's the case? And if that's the case, then the implication is the voice in your head is not you. And what the teachers tell us and the traditions tell us is that that's not a belief, that's a fact. And the evidence speaks for the fact. The evidence shows it's true. Because if you look to see what the evidence says if the voice in the head is me, then why do I have to look to see what it says to know what I think? If it's me, I'm producing the thoughts. But if I ask you what you think, you will look to see what the voice says and tell me. So that's one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence, if the voice in the head is me, then I can stop it and start it, right? So stop thinking right now. Stop thinking. Give it a shot. Another piece of evidence that the voice isn't you, because you can't stop it, right? Third piece of evidence, can you control the content of the voice, right? Can you control the content of the voice? Can you control what the voice is saying? Give it a shot. Try not to think of a pink elephant right now. The other thing about the voice that's interesting is that the voice is happening to you. You don't have any control over what it's saying, you know? The fact that you don't have control over what it's saying and you have to live with it, right, is called neurosis. You don't have control over what it's saying, you have to live with it, so it's driving you crazy to be you. Right? Driving you crazy to be you. Well, the thing about it is that and this is an interesting thing, you know, because one of the things we say in these practices and teachings is don't go to war with it and don't try and stop it or control it. That's one of the mistakes that people make when they practice meditation. They think, oh, I'm not supposed to think. This is about stopping thinking, right? No, this is not about stopping thinking, right? Thinking will stop on its own when you stop feeding it. If you don't put gas in your car, it's not going to run. If you don't feed your pet, it'll die. If you don't give energy to the thought process, it will dissolve, because the energy that it runs on is your attention. And it's interesting, you know, we could say, you know, that, oh, well, the thought process is always going on. If I move my attention, I'm just not paying attention to it, right? Well, the reality of it is, it's not actually going on if you're not paying attention to it. You know what I mean? In other words, the only way I could answer your question as to whether, or anybody could answer your question as to whether the thought process continues to go on and you're just not paying attention to it, is if there's some way to be able to hear it going on while you're not paying attention to it. But there's no way to do that, you know? So all we care about here is the practical implication, which is if you're not there for it, it won't bother you. If you're not there for it, it won't bother you, right? So what you have to do is you have to move out of your head and move your life into the world, right? Because if your life was being lived in the world, there's no problem there. Everything is as it is, right? The problem is when things happen, right? And you think about them, the thinking creates the problem. Because the thinking creates the idea that things should be consistent with the way I think. And if it's not, that's a problem. And it's even worse because the thinking that we do and the thinking that we pay attention to is self-righteous. Don't you think your thinking is the correct thinking? Right? We all don't question the fact that we don't consider our thoughts to be thoughts. We consider our thoughts to be reflections of reality, right? That's why when I think something and you think something different, right? Well, you must not be in contact with reality, Frank, because listen to what I'm thinking, listen to what I'm thinking. Get it straight, get it right, right? That's one of the problems that we have is every entity considers itself to be right. I would enjoy watching a person who is doing illusions, these magicians. Even though I know what they're doing, I watch it because it's so good that they can do it, right? But so there are two groups of people. If you look at, and I've mentioned this here, I think it's very useful to go and look at some of the videos of these illusionists, right? And then you watch what they're doing, and it's interesting because when you watch what you're doing, even though you know what they're doing is impossible, the brain will think they did do it, right? So you watch these people do these illusions and watch the people around them, and the people say, how did you do that? How did you do that? Right? And the answer is always the same. They didn't do that, right? It's a game, people are so gullible, right? That the one thing that people don't think when they watch these illusionists work is that the other people there aren't in on it. You automatically assume that, right? But it's almost always the case that they are in on it, and when you see that they're in on it, there's no trick anymore, right? So that's the same thing. What is it about? It's about distracting your attention. It's about getting you to look at something with a belief you have, right? So you're believing what you're seeing, right? That's a mistake, right? Especially when it comes to illusionists, to believe what you see, right? So you really have to start to pay attention to what's going on instead of staying ignorant, right? Instead of staying ignorant. Ignorant means you're ignoring. You got to stop ignoring. How do you stop ignoring? Well, you pay attention. How do you pay attention? You practice paying attention. You practice paying attention. And the first thing you have to realize in order to practice paying attention is you need to be motivated to do it, because you start to understand through the teachings that if you don't pay attention, you're going to keep suffering, because the same patterns are going to keep playing. Your brain's going to keep playing the same stupid stuff over and over again. Don't you ever notice that? If you've been married or you've been in a relationship for any period of time, it's almost impossible to notice that this isn't the first time we did this, right? This isn't the first time I got pissed off about this. This isn't the first time I called you that name, right? After a while, it begins to, what the hell's going on, Because when you come out of the anger, when you're in an argument with somebody, usually when you calm down a little bit, you look back at what you were doing and say, what the hell was I thinking? What happened here? But then you don't want to admit that to the person you had the argument with. You want to stay right, right? So you don't tell them, right? But in this process, what happens as you wake up, you realize that you don't need to maintain an attachment to the illusion anymore. You don't have to protect yourself anymore. There's nothing to protect anymore. When you have a direct experience of the truth of yourself, one of the things that's very clear and evident is there's nothing to protect. What would it be like to walk down the street and know that nobody could have anything on you? Because you have nothing to hide, right? That's not the way it is for a person who is living their life as a personality, because the personality is inherently paranoid, isn't it? Yeah, the personality is inherently paranoid, worried about what people think, worried about how I look, right? That's the personality. When you get freed up from that and you start to experience the truth of yourself as awareness, as space itself, does the space in this room get upset about what we're doing? That's the analogy that's a good analogy for you to understand the possibility of being your true nature, being your true self. Your true nature is awareness. Your true nature is like space. It's like the space in this room. If I ask you to tell me everything in this room, you'd probably Tell me everything that you see and then say that's it. And the one thing you probably would leave out is the space in the room. Okay? Same thing with yourself. The one thing you leave out is your actual nature, because you're paying attention to things that have form and shape the same way you pay attention to things that have form and shape in this room if you look around. That's why you wouldn't notice the space, because it doesn't have form and it doesn't have shape. And that's the nature of awareness. It doesn't have form and it doesn't have shape, and it's unaffected by anything that's happening in that awareness, just like the space in this room. You could kill somebody here, the space wouldn't have a problem. A baby could be born here, space doesn't have a problem. No. It could be light, it could be dark, hot, cold, doesn't matter. Space is never affected by what's happening in the space. And that's exactly the same way it is for you as the awareness that is the reality of what you are, right? So if you can start to get this, if you can start to get an appreciation of this and see what the possibility is, then you begin to realize that, as, who was it, Plato that said an unexamined life is not worth living, right? If you start to get the idea of what this is talking about, you realize that you cannot afford to stay asleep. If you stay asleep, your body will drop at some point, right? And you will never have been here living a life, because the only life you will have known is the one you have lived in your head. The thinking life is the life that most people are experiencing, the thinking life, right? So what this is about is called presence, right? It's about learning that there's a possibility that you could actually experience life, the way life is, without resisting it, without arguing with it, without being in conflict with it, without fighting against it, right? It's called flow. It's called flow, right? So this is a real possibility, and it offers freedom. It offers the real possibility of being happy without a reason. It offers the real possibility of being satisfied and content regardless of the situation that you find yourself in. That sounds almost too good to be true, right? In fact, the mental state will probably at some point, if you do pursue this process, at some point will start to tell you, oh, this doesn't work. That's what people say about meditation, right? But we live in a world right now that people will only try something for a certain period of time before they say it doesn't work. You know, that doesn't work. So I'm not going to do that anymore. You know, what's next, right? That's the way people are living their life right now, right? But if you do make a commitment to this through understanding what it makes possible, right, then you will realize that this offers you everything you ever wanted. And I'm not saying meditation itself offers you everything you ever wanted. I'm saying that it's a tool that you can use to get access to everything you ever wanted. And everything you ever wanted is immediately available all the time. It's not tomorrow, it's not yesterday, it's always only here right now. And all you have to do to experience it and appreciate it and enjoy it is let go of your good ideas. Let go of the thinking about it and start experiencing the living of it, the actual living of a life, right? And so that becomes a practice that comes out of the formal practice of meditation, where you start to realize, oh, wait a minute. If I'm driving my car and somebody is in front of me that's going too slow, and the voice in my head starts to curse them out, maybe it's not just the voice in my head, starts to curse them out, does it ever occur to me that they can't hear me? They don't give a shit that I'm upset. I'm upsetting myself. You know, when you start to realize this, and then you start to realize, wait a minute, when I practice meditation, I'm able to move my attention from the thinking activity to my breath. And when I do that, whatever I was thinking about isn't happening anymore. And therefore, if it was upsetting thoughts, I'm not upset anymore. Maybe I should practice this when I'm driving. Maybe I should practice this all the time. Because if you start to pay attention, you'll realize that you spend most of your life upset. Don't you? Yeah. You spend most of your life upset. What do I mean by that? I mean, you walk around in your life with your expectations about reality, right? And as you live your life with your expectations about reality, you keep noticing when what's happening doesn't fit those expectations, and then you get upset. The very definition of upset is an unfulfilled expectation, isn't it? So if you start paying attention to your expectations, then you'll start to get a good sense of why you're upset a lot of the time. You don't want to be upset, right? Then give your expectations up and start to have your expectations be consistent with reality. All you have to do is make one shift, make one change, and practice that one change, and your life will be much, much easier and much more fulfilling. And that one shift is expect things to be the way they are. Most people would never even think of that. Oh, expect things to be the way they are? Why would I do that? Because that's the way they are. That's why you would do that. And if you don't accept things the way they are, if you don't let things be the way they are, if you don't interact with life the way life is, you suffer. And life doesn't give a damn. You know, life doesn't care whether you get it together or not. Gravity doesn't care whether you obey. You know, you can get up on the roof and jump off. Gravity won't flinch at all. You'll just die. That's how it is. That's how it is. Reality works a certain way. It doesn't care what you think. It doesn't care what your experiences were. You either get it right and start to flow with the flow, right? Or you continue to suffer the rest of your life. And the only way you're going to be able to get it right and flow with the flow is you've got to start to understand, you've got to get out of your head and start to experience life as life is. Now, the trick with that, right, is that if the way you do that is to say, oh, I get it now, the right thing to do is to not be in my head and be in the world. And so now I'm going to do the right thing and be in the world, right? That will fail. That will fail. Because you have to include, and this is where it gets very interesting. In order for it to work, you have to include everything. You can't say, oh, I'll accept everything but this. No, you have to include everything, right, for it to work, including your own insanity. So if you really want to be in the flow of life, right, you have to accept everything as it is, including you, including your mind, including your conditioning, including your patterns, including your habits, right? If you can accept all that as it is, right? Why? Because it is. That's why it is. You either accept it or reject it. You have nothing to say about it. You have nothing to say about the thoughts that occur in your mind. You have nothing to say about the emotions that come up in your body. You have nothing to say about it. It's all happening by itself. Most people never stop long enough to pay attention and notice that that's the case, right? When you have an emotion, when you become aware of it, it's already occurred, hasn't it? So you didn't cause the emotion happened to you. You didn't cause the thought happened to you, right? So the only place that you have any say-so about it is how you relate to that. That's all. You don't have anything to say about the content of it. All you have anything to say about is how you relate to that. You don't have anything to say about what's happening. The only thing you have to say about it is how you relate to that. You know, can you relate to that by letting go and allowing it to be the way it is? Or do you want to continue to resist it? Do you want to continue to struggle? Do you want to continue to fight with it? Do you want to be in conflict with it? Right? And notice the damage that it's doing to you physically and psychologically and emotionally. It will shorten your life. It'll ruin your relationships. It'll keep you from sleeping. It'll make life harder and worse as it goes on, as the Buddhists say, right? Suffering involves old age, sickness, and death. Which means you guys ought to be a very attentive audience. Because that's when it hurts the most, right? If you've been living a stupid life, as you get older, it hurts more, right? Because you come more into contact with what you can't control. It becomes more obvious that you can't control it. And if you fight harder, it gets worse. Listen, you got to listen here. This stuff isn't easy, I know that, okay? Right? But you don't regret anything. Regrets happen to you. See what I'm saying? That's the first thing you got to get clear about, is regrets take the form of thoughts and emotions. All that's happening to you, right? You don't have anything to say about it. The question is, when it happens, how do you relate to it, right? And if you're paying attention, and if you start being present, and if you start to be present to the thought activity, and you realize that a large majority of the thought activity is a waste of energy, right? You're henriching energy is what Muji used to say, right? You're henriching energy, right? No wonder you're tired all the time, right? Because you're thinking about things that make no difference all the time. Even the neuroscientists are telling us, they're backing this up, and they're saying it's only about 30% of your mental activity that's useful at all. The rest of it's a waste of energy. 70% of your thought activity is a waste of energy. It's called the default state. So one of the things that you can do by learning to pay attention is to pay attention to what's going on in the thinking activity so that you can recognize when it's a waste of energy, so that you can recognize what you're thinking about makes no difference. When you're in the default state, right, which means you're thinking about yourself, the default state is when your attention doesn't have to be given to something in order to function, right? So you're free to just relax and, mind wander, right? And as the neuroscientists tell us today, mind wandering is not a good idea. Mind wandering, if you pay attention, you'll see when your mind is free to wander, you become the subject and the thought process is totally neurotic. You become the subject and the thought process is totally neurotic. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're worried about yourself, you're worried about what you want, you're worried about what you don't want, you're worried about the past, you're worried about the future, right? And none of that, it makes any difference. It's just spinning the wheel. It's just spinning wheels, just spinning wheels, just spinning wheels. So if you use these teachings to pay attention to something that does make a difference, and practice something that does make a difference, then you will be less willing to spend time with what doesn't make a difference, right? Especially if you stay with this practice and these teachings long enough to start to get the benefit. When the fruit starts to grow on the tree so that you can enjoy the fruit of the practice and of these teachings, right? Then it'll be a lot easier to find the motivation to continue. Because ultimately, if you continue this process, right, what you can ultimately arrive at is complete liberation, freedom. Freedom from what? From suffering. What's the source of suffering? Thinking things should be different. It's that simple. It's that simple. It's that simple to say it, right? But to live it, another story. That's why practice becomes so critical. You've got to practice these teachings, and the only way you can practice these teachings is you've got to train your mind. You've got to stop letting the voice in your head run the show. You've got to pay attention, so when it wants to do what it wants to do that has no use or purpose, that you move your attention away. No, I'm not doing that. That's what you saw in that movie, in Revolver, in the last scene. Wow, it looks like the end of the world. Maybe we don't have to continue this. But in that last scene in Revolver, the ego is confronting the person, and the person has woken up and realized, right, who they are, right? In the movie, I don't know if you picked it up, the big boss, Mr. Gold, right? So excellent they called him Mr. Gold, and nobody ever sees Mr. Gold. But when he realizes that he's Mr. Gold, right, that the real self is Mr. Gold, and the ego is confronting him and challenging him and threatening him, and he has a gun on him, right? And he just looks at the ego and walks past him and walks away. That is what has to happen for all of us if you want to experience being free from the tyranny of your own mind.